But of course, a massive game on Sunday. It is the Women's World Cup final down under in Australia, and England have got there, and they're up against Spain. Now, of course, it's live in talkSPORT this morning. We're streaming live on YouTube and Facebook as always. But a few raised eyebrows yesterday when the man at the top of the FA, the chief executive, Mark Bulliam, gave a pre-World Cup final, if you like, interview. And quite rightly, he said, Sarina Wiegman, of course, doing the Lionesses, great job. It's critical that she does that job, and she's doing a brilliant job at that. And then he carried on. If at some point in the future she decides she wants to move into the men's game, I think that would be a really interesting discussion. But that's for her, right? Yeah, it is for her, I'm pretty sure. He says, we don't like suggesting the men's team is above that. Sarina's doing a great job in what she's doing. Secondly, I don't like the language when we say, should it be the best man for the job? I think it's the best person for the job. And then he says, from our point of view, Sarina's doing a great job in what she's doing, and we want her to keep doing that. If and when we get a vacancy in either of our senior men's or women's manager positions, we would go for the best person for the job, which would be the best person capable of winning matches. We're joined by talkSPORT's Lionesses correspondent Courtney Sweetman-Kirk. Courtney, good morning to you. First off, the atmosphere down there must be building up a pace towards Sunday, is it?
Yeah, it definitely is. Everyone's really excited, as you'd imagine. A World Cup final. We're currently in Terrigal, the base for the Lionesses. And yes, there is excitement, but there's also a nice calmness about the camp as well, which I'm feeling good about.
I know you've spoken to Sarina Wiegman, and I think we'll be hearing that from about 12 noon onwards. Before we get to that, what was your take on what Bullingham said yesterday? I mean, you've been in the thick of it, Courtney, and of course you know the women's game inside out. And you know Sarina inside out. Can you envisage the day that the first ever female manager in the men's game comes in the biggest and most high profile job possible? England. In other words, could you ever envisage Sarina doing what Southgate does?
I could. I've had the pleasure of being around her. I think she's been fantastic, as I think I've said many times. She's so charismatic as a person and open and giving with what she gives us. But in terms of obviously what happens on the pitch and what she's created for the Lionesses in the FA has been nothing short of phenomenal. She's brought that winning culture at the mentality to the Lionesses, and I'm sure she's got the ability to bring that to the men's team if she chose that way and she wishes that's the path that her career might want to take after her contract's up in 2025.
That said, Courtney, do you think Bullingham should be speaking like this before such a huge fixture, the biggest ever?
Well, I think it's difficult, isn't it? He's in a position where the questions have been asked of him as well. So, he's got to answer those questions in a certain way from the press. I think he answered it well if you look at sort of the full statement of it. And I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I agree in terms of I don't think this is what we should be talking about before a major World Cup final. I think we should be talking about how well the girls have done, how well Sarina's done, and focusing more on that rather than something else. But, it's the world we live in. And as I say, it's the question that's been asked of him. And I think, as you say, if you look through the full manuscript of what he said, he's answered it in the right way. He's talking about, how he wants the FA to be diverse in their talent pool and who they employ. When the time does arise that there might be a vacancy within the men's side.
Courtney, stay with us. Simon and Martin are with me. So the chief executive, Simon, Mark Bulliam, believes there's no reason why Sarina Wiegman should not be considered for the England men's manager job in the future. Is he right to think that? Was he right to answer the question even before Sunday's final?
No, I don't think it's a necessary conversation at this moment in time. What you've got is a Women's World Cup final. That is the subject matter. If other people want to take it off in directions and talk about the advancement of women in men's sport, then that's a conversation that they can have amongst themselves. The head of the FA doesn't need to disappear into an ESG mentality of deciding that I need to address things in a certain way because we need to be steeped in equality, diversity and inclusivity. What we need to be is steeped in the best in class. If we get to a point And I think most sensible people know that there is a very significant difference at this moment in time between women's football and men's football in terms of the level of technical ability and the achievements of the two games. Now, that's not to suggest over a period of time that those gaps won't be closed. What I would like to think is that the best in class, I'm one of those people that believes the best in class should get the job, and I don't really care if it's someone of a different gender than the sport that we're talking about in this instance, the men's sport. I don't care about ethnicity. I don't care about any of it. All I ever wanted in my life was to have the best in class. I don't think it's a grown-up conversation at this moment in time. I think it's an agenda-driven one. If you're the head of the FA, you don't have to answer these questions. You don't have to drive yourself into a situation where you want to appear to be operating in a certain way. I think the guy's a flake. I think selling the FA Cup and wanting to sell Wembley Stadium and other things that the FA should be attending to with more importance, I have more prevalence in terms of competency than addressing an issue that's not really an issue at this moment in time. It may well be for those that believe it's the necessary step. It's a necessary step. We must now have equality in men's sport by having women represented in it. And that may well be when women get to the top of the table and best in class and they can operate in a sport which is polar different right now. There is vast difference between men's football and women's football. What Sarina Wiegman is doing is a remarkably good job in the space that she's in right now.
But that would preclude her from getting the Southgate job, is what you're saying.
Well, I don't think it's a conversation...
Because of polar differences.
Well, I think right now we need to see... I have no objection to it. A lot was made of the fact that Del Vince put Hannah Langley in situ to manage the Forest Green Rovers job, and people turned around and looked at that in a certain way, and then she was there for 5 minutes and she was gone. When we see women operating within the confines of men's football and operating at a very high level in the domestic game, because there is a difference, there's a different language, in expectations, in physicality, in the technical ability, in size and scale, in experiences, in scale of the operation and size. But what we're seeing right now is a remarkable transition in women's football. We put a man into women's football, and they couldn't achieve anything vaguely resembling what Sarina Wiegman's achieved in Phil Neville. If the example is being made about, well, if you can translate from women's football, if you can be successful in women's football, you can be successful in men's. If you run a business with 10 people in it, it doesn't mean that you can run a business with 1,000 people in it. There's different skill sets. I'm not ruling it out. I don't have any objection to it. There's no misogyny in suggesting that there's a time and a place for it.
Sure.
But I think it's an unnecessary... He wanted to have this conversation.
Yeah.
He wants to position the FA in a certain way. What I would like to see the FA positioned is a competent organisation, and I'm not entirely sure that they are.
Well, he's been questioned in this area, and he has to, because of Sarina Wiegman's success on the pitch and the women's team, the development of that's the reason why this question's been posed.
But it's very easy, Martin, isn't it? I'm here to talk about the women's World Cup final. Other things can happen in different conversations. The sole focus is...
But what else was he to say?
Precisely that.
Shut it down.
No, well, he could have done, but then he would have been probably criticised for that too. And I just think it's a very interesting topic. I think I'd like to see Sarina Wiegman, if she were given the opportunity to go into the professional men's game, not at international level, but maybe at club level, to sort of earn that respect, I suppose, to be the acceptance, because we are in the middle of change, huge change. My reservations are that the professional game for ladies are not their own fault, by the way, because of the ban that took place from 1921. For 50 years, they discriminated against. They weren't allowed to play football, which was a disgrace. But the FA now, of course, is working to develop the WSL game, which is, and they're a big advocate for that, and that should be applauded. Whether the game now eventually splits away and forms like a Premier League, as the men's game does, all those possibilities are there. But these are sort of the first steps. So I think Sarina Wiegman would be a massive loss to the women's game if she was to come to the men's game.
I think, Courtney, you'd agree with Martin on that.
She should be allowed to stay there. But what her choice is her choice.
Well, I don't think it's whether she'll be allowed to say that. I think if she wins it on Sunday, she can do what she wants. But Courtney, the bottom line is this: the men's game and the women's game are very different, are they not? But would you advocate, sooner than later? And if it's Wiegman, someone's got to do it. So why not now? Would you push that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm loving this conversation, to be honest, because I like having this conversation in the sense that it needs to be had. I do think there's such a proclivity to compare the men's and women's game. It is different. and we can't get away from that, and we can, enjoy them both. And going back to the comment, Simon made about Phil Neville, I get that he's played at the highest level, but he's never even coached really at the highest level in the men's game. Let alone the
Courtney,
women's.
Courtney, just to say,
that's right.
Courtney, just I'm loving this conversation too. So I just want to know, what was the feeling amongst the players when there was a player, men's player, former player, top level, coming into your game and not really with the necessary credentials? Was there a problem of acceptance for him?
I think there was, to a degree. I think, look, the women's game is accepting, so it was never a case of shunning Phil Neville. But like we've talked about, he hasn't even coached at the top level within the women's or the men's game. So to go in straight at the top, as an England manager, for me, I'm not speaking for anyone else. For me, it felt like a publicity stunt, as simple as that. Because
he did 2 years as a Manchester United coach. No, he was gaining a lot of experience. He hadn't been a manager, granted.
Yeah, but I think that's very different to being day in, day out, working, earning your stripes. To for an example, I know that the games are different, but you would never put a manager in with that level of experience to a top level men's England team, without a doubt. So to do it at the women's, like I say, that's my personal thought. I felt like it was a publicity stunt.
But with respect, Courtney, if you pair that back to Mark Sampson and look at the evolution of women's football and go back to Hope Powell, it's about where we are in the curve and where the game is being developed to and what level it's at and where we think people are developing at their best. Now, the Women's World Cup started in 1990, and we're moving through the gears now to a far more professional, far more competent, far more technically adept and adroit set of elite women footballers. The argument that will be pitted by those that want to have this argument, and this is a grown-up conversation, some people don't want to have a grown-up conversation, will be about creating division and advancing agendas. When Graeme Souness spoke last year after a game about a man's game being played by men, it was leveraged by certain people, one of them being a current England player, to turn it into some sort of division between men and women. I don't think there needs to be division. If women's football develops at the rate that it's developing, it will catch up to a point where the levels are, at some point, perhaps comparable. And then that conversation can happen.
Yes.
And then if there's an exclusion, then people can start talking about equality.
Yeah. Let's return to what Simon was saying. And essentially, Bullingham's comments at this particular time going into the World Cup final could by some be viewed as somewhat divisive.
It's hard, isn't it? Because he's been asked a question, and I do get what Simon's saying in the sense that he needs to potentially not answer that question. But there's always two sides to the coin in the way that things get construed. So if he doesn't answer that question, it might be, right, well, they don't believe in Sarina. They don't believe that there should be a women in the elite, in the men's side. I think he's got caught in the fire where he's sort of covered all bases with his answer. He's not said yes, he's not said no. I think he's probably tried to sort of peddle a line with the FA in terms of trying to do and say the right thing at the right time.
It's disrespectful to the women's game, Courtney. The women's game needs the best talent. Why is there an assumption that, as a matter of course, all roads must lead to the men's game? Why does it have to be that particular conversation needs to happen? You've got an elite manager managing England's women that are achieving things that the men can only dream of right now. And why do we have to have a conversation about her hop-tailing it off to the men's game? The women's game is an elite game.
I totally agree.
And I think it's disrespectful. And if I was the F, I wouldn't answer that question. He chose to answer that question. And if we're entirely honest while we have this conversation and share this moment together, at this stage in the evolution of women's football, they're not at that level. That's not to suggest they won't be. That's not to suggest that there's not a pathway for that to happen, and when it does happen, that it should be embraced. But if people are being honest, if you ask Mark Bullingham, in the next 18 months, could you imagine, really, honestly, that Sarina Wiegman is capable, when Gareth Southgate's contract runs out at the end of the next tournament, of running the England men's team? The answer, honestly, if we're not frightened of the conversation, is probably no. But that doesn't mean no in perpetuity. It means let's throw our resources behind getting the women's game to the highest level so that the uniqueness of the men's games is at least equalled or paralleled by the women's game.
Yeah, I mean, there's one interesting point being made by one of the listeners this morning, and many people getting in touch, Courtney, as you might imagine, on this one. David in Newark, after Spain win the thing on Sunday, well, we don't know if they will or they won't, would Vilda be considered for the men's job for Spain? Well, the answer to that, to be honest, Courtney, is probably not, isn't it?
Yeah, probably not. And if people know the situation with Spain coming into this tournament as well, that it's been very, very turbulent in terms of lots of issues within that camp, and them not wanting, him to even be in the women's job, let alone the men's job. So I can't see that happening. But what I will agree with Simon is it's disrespectful at this moment in time. We should be talking about the wonderful achievement of these girls and Sarina Wiegman and what she has done, and potentially winning a World Cup on a historic day for English football, and not seeing, that there's, as I say, there's a proclivity to compare the women's and the men's game. We don't have to do that. We can enjoy them for what they are and what it is, and not see, she's done that, so she's going to go and do something in the women's game.
It is an important point, Martin, isn't it? The very nature of the conversation could be construed as divisive, couldn't it? We're talking about the women's game, and we're talking about the men's game. Many people that would believe the two should not meet in the middle. But at this particular time, the women's game at international level dominates the conversation because of how well England have done.
It does. And it will be let's not forget the generations of women that were denied the right to play football, Jim. And here they are now striking back very quickly. I was actually in a situation where there was a good friend of mine, Kathleen Parker, was having to play under an assumed boy's name to play in our school team. And she was one of our best players. So there's still a lot of hurt around, and they're striking back. It was a disgrace that they weren't allowed to play football.
Come on, Martin. Let's not visit pain on people that haven't experienced it.
Just a minute.
That's like going back to arguments for the fact that women didn't have the vote in the 1920s, and people in the 2020s are still feeling the pain for it. But the point is, the people that are now having the vote don't have the pain from the people in the 1920s. Let's look at the generation now that are playing football.
And football, women are showing that they were wrongly denied the opportunity to play football because they're playing with the technique I'm seeing in this World Cup.
No dispute.
You'll see it from Spain. If we turn to the game, they're probably it's going to be our most difficult game of this competition.
No one's arguing this point. And when you talk about the fact that the women couldn't play in football in the 70s and 80s, they can have the 70s and 80s because nobody was enjoying football in the 70s, 80s. Everything was going bust. All the stadiums were falling down, and we were having tragedies left, right, and centre. We're now in the 90s, 2000s and 2020s, and women's football is evolving.
Yes,
and the conversation should be fantastic.
But it's in its infancy. It's in its infancy, really, because it's been held back.
What we want to do is we want to advance women's football to an elite level. We want the best women in women's football to stay within the sport, to be able to advance it to its highest level, rather than sitting there virtue signaling their way through to it, say, well, actually, what I want to do is I want to look politically correct, and I want to look balanced and inclusive and diverse in my thinking, rather than being the leaders that we need the FA to be, and say, right, women's football needs as much help as it can possibly get, and we need the best